A lot of energy, so you'll get to see that.
ابني كان ثالثة ثانوي، عنده 18 سنة و3 أشهر و6 أيام. كان من ضمن أطرس الأهلاوي، وراح يشجع زي بقية صحابه ومفيش أي مشكلة خالص. فوجئت إن أنا لقيته مرمي في المشرحة. ده ابني، يعني كتر خيرهم بصراحة، جابوا لنا 74 شهيد، بس أنا عارف إن هو في أكتر من كده. أنا جاي النهارده عشان أذكر الناس بيوم 26 بيوم القصاص. وببلغ السيد الرئيس محمد مرسي وهو انت قابلتنا مرتين قبل ما تبقى رئيس جمهوريه، ووعدتنا ان انت اول حاجه دم العيال ده دمهم في رقبتي، وانا بقول لك من دلوقتي انت بقيت رئيس ودم العيال دي فعلا في رقبتك، ودم العيال دي في رقبه السيد الرئيس. واحنا دلوقتي طالبين من حضرتك تعاملهم زي معامله الشهداء بالظبط الثوره، عيالنا ما يسوا، عيالنا كلها متعلمين وما فيهمش اي حد جاي. الثوره لحد دلوقتي مفيش اي حد خد اعدام ولا سجن ولا اي شيء، كل واحد بيطلع براه، كله بيطلع براه، من ساعه الثوره ما بدات ما شفناش اي حد. لا توقعات 26 ان شاء الله، يعني الدنيا دي كلها اللي انت شايفها دي في اداء 100 مره كمان هيجي، يعني كتير جدا هيجي، ده مش كلام، لا دي حقيقه ان شاء الله. فمش عشان خاطر حاجه، لا عشان واقفين ورا اخواتهم اللي شافوهم ويموتوا وما عرفوش يعملوا لهم حاجه. الشعب يريد اعدام المشير، الشعب يريد اعدام المشير، الشعب يريد اعدام المشير.
it is clear that the Egyptian revolution or the revolutionary process is not really in great shape. There is nothing really exceptional in this when you look at the whole region and the 6 countries in which revolutionary upheavals have erupted over the last 3 years. I think the situation in general is quite tragic, maybe with the relative and significant exception of Tunisia, where things seem to be going much better. This being said, we are, I think, in the midst of a long-term revolutionary process. It is normal, I think, in this context to have ebbs and flows, to have ups and downs, but it is particularly important to understand, I think, the current conjuncture in Egypt, which I think is really problematic. So what I will try to focus on is understanding this moment in the larger sense, the post-June, July 2013 period with its contradictions. So I'll focus on that, but I'll start with, very briefly, a discussion of what is really qualitatively new in this period, and then I will end by few ideas about what is to be done. What is to be done at the level of the workers' movement in particular, and what is to be done at the level of the left, and specifically the revolutionary left. Now, despite the fact that I think there is clearly, especially we can see this from Diana's talk, a significant increase in the level of repression, I would say that this, what is qualitatively new does not really lie here. In fact, Egypt under Mubarak had high levels of repression, and this was an essential part of the reasons that led to the revolution. But since then, we have had lots of repression over the last 3 years. Under SCAF, there were systematic massacres, actually, against revolutionaries of different sorts. Something similar can be said about Morsi. Maybe the level of massacres has reduced a little bit, but other forms of oppression have been intensified, such as those against women, against Christians, against all sorts of communities, of minorities. So I would say that what really is qualitatively different does not lie in repression, even though the level is increasing. What is new and alarming, really, is that, first of all, this repression, and I'll say something briefly about it, is accompanied by really a climate that one would describe as, it has been described actually as a kind of collective mass psychosis, or, you know, general hysteria, including the cult of personality represented in the defense minister and probably future president El-Sisi. But also, it is accompanied by a revival of a kind of nationalism, really nationalism in this case, in the very bad sense of the term, jingoistic nationalism, which tries somehow to mold itself on the Nasser anti-imperialism of the 50s and 60s, but in a rather caricatural way. So, to give you just an example of how absurd this collective psychosis is, and the general climate of intolerance in the country, one issue that have been discussed seriously over the last few weeks ago, actually, was a comic puppet associated with Vodafone, used in an online advertisement for the company. And in fact, the prosecutor has officially charged Vodafone executives of having a secret code within this advertisement in which it was inciting for terrorist attacks and so on. It was taken very seriously, and it went to the prosecution. Something similar happened more recently with Pepsi, with another advertisement. What is alarming is that these were taken very seriously by public opinion and you know, TV talks and so on, people on the street talking about them very seriously. Now, there is clearly, on this moment, regardless of how we can analyze it, whether it's temporary or not, a counter-revolutionary mood in the country. What is alarming about the repression that is going on is that, in fact, it is popular. Under SCAF, the repression was faced to the counter to the repression. There was lots of resistance, and in fact, SCAF had to make concessions. Well, one can start even with Mubarak. I mean, during the 18 days uprising that led to his ouster, tremendous violence was used against the protesters, but the radicalization of the movement, its scale and its deepening social element forced Mubarak to go. SCAF also was forced, after a series of massacres, especially in October, November 2011, to announce actually announce that presidential elections would take place earlier than they wanted, and they had to make concessions and they had to leave ultimately. The same, of course, applies to Morsi, who was ousted in 30 June, 3 July, then in what was, regardless of the forces behind it, but it was genuinely a huge popular mobilization. What is new then is that the current repression is actually extremely popular. In a shallow way, I think, but it is popular. Fatma Stokes mentioned the fact that the level of labor protest has been reduced, and that in general, employers, to give just the example of worker struggle as one indication of the mood, that employers feel emboldened by the current climate, and that they are on the attack, and that so worker struggles are more defensive. In fact, they are not only more defensive, but they have been reduced tremendously. To give you just an example of the scale, under Mubarak, during the decades that led to his ouster, it is estimated that there were 3,400 collective actions, strikes and others. And this was a high level by Egypt's standards, and in fact, especially the years 2004, 2008 witnessed a huge wave of worker struggle. Now, in 2011, the first year of the revolution after Mubarak's fall, the level of struggle increased with more confidence and so on. So you had 1,400 collective worker struggles during the year. This increased, it almost doubled, no, not double, but it increased by maybe 50 or 60% in 2012. So partly under SCAF and partly under Morsi, it became almost 2,000 collective actions. And then during the first few months, the first quarter of 2013, the number reached 2,400 collective struggles. And this definitely was a very important element in the mobilizations that led to Morsi's downfall. Why now? There are no clear statistics now, but definitely the numbers in the rest of 2013 are not comparable at all to this. At least the reduction is by 1 to 20 or so, at least, or even perhaps more drastic. Now, Fatma's Ramadan explains that in part this reflects a certain kind of waiting mood among workers. Let us wait and see. People have lots of expectations. But it is true that there is also among workers, and she referred to this, certain popularity for the regime. Not just popularity for the regime in the sense that it is good, but the idea has become really much more dominant that struggle is absurd, that the economy is in danger, that the whole country is in danger, we have to all stand together, and of course under the notion that there is a war on terrorism and therefore we have to have total solidarity until we vanquish this. Now, how did we come here? This is what I really want to focus upon. And I think that it is clear today that regardless of how we analyze the situation, that the state has been rehabilitated. It is still a very much authoritarian state, even more authoritarian than ever perhaps. It has been rehabilitated, I mean, in Not that anything positive has changed. To the contrary, the reasons that led to this revolution, in fact, the causes are still there. If anything, things have deteriorated. But this rehabilitation of the state requires us, I think, to look a bit carefully at the state and its relation to the revolution. I think that here there are two possible ways of looking at the state, and I think that they are both useful. As Marxists, we tend to look structurally at the state as an organ of class power, and I think this is fundamental, of course, and it explains the general dynamics of the revolution. So I will not really elaborate upon this, but at this level, of course, I think class struggle was an essential component of this whole revolutionary process. At the same time, there have been clearly inner weaknesses in the revolutionary struggle that explained in part, at least in large part, I think, where we are today. And to be very brief, I would say that it is the problem of the separation of the economic and the political. We've had during the decade of struggles that led to the Mubarak's ouster, a high level of worker struggle, and at the same time an important pro-democracy movement calling for political change. These have rarely managed to meet, actually. In fact, the glorious thing about the 18-day uprising that ousted Mubarak was that finally these two converged. Not only converged, but they took a scale which is unprecedented with millions. It is estimated that 12 to 15 million actively participated in the revolutionary mobilization, and we know that in the last few days before Mubarak's ouster, there was a huge mass strike. In fact, it could have reached a general strike had Mubarak not been forced out. And it was clear during these exceptional days that the workers' movement striking was really merging economic demands about wages, conditions, and so on, with the political demand of democracy, of specifically ousting Mubarak, but also changing the whole regime. But since then, while you had the two sorts of mobilization, they managed really, they never converged again. And we can try to think later or during the discussion of why this is the case, but this is the case. I think an important element of this is a certain incapacity of the workers' movement so far to generalize its struggle. Struggles have been local. The independent unions that emerged played a great role at the grassroots, and it's important to say that independent unions are very significant because in Egypt under Mubarak and before, since the Nasser time, the trade union structure has been totally dominated by the state. It has become really an arm of the state rather than an organ of worker struggle, even of a reformist nature. So independent unions were important. They were very militant. They led to the creation in different stages to 3 important trade union federations. But while the local unions were much more militant than even their federations, as we saw also from Fatma's talk, but generally speaking, even the local unions remained narrowly focused on economic issues. Relatively, of course. They were also raising the question of democracy in the sense that the demand itself of legalizing trade unions was a political demand, but almost apart from that, this did not link to further political questions about, for instance, the repression of Christians, of women, the dictatorial tendencies of the different, I wouldn't say regimes, because I think it is basically the same regime, but the different manifestations of the regime that ruled throughout. At the same time, the political aspect of the revolution remained dominated by essentially liberal nationalist perspectives that are quite elitist and do not see at all the significance of the workers' movement. At best, they even sometimes, and more often than not, are quite hostile to it on class terms, arguing that it's a distraction from the pro-democracy struggle to be focused on limited class issues and so on. So I think this was essentially an important weakness in the revolutionary struggle. But more specifically, I think we are witnessing really profoundly what we can call revolutionary fatigue. Another weakness of the revolutionary process in Egypt, and this is also the case all over the Arab world, is that the element of movement in this mobilization, revolution as movement, as a massive movement, was there, relatively healthy despite its weaknesses. But the element of revolution as change, and this is also an important aspect of revolution as gaining radical change in the nature of the state, in the policies pursued and so on, this has been extremely weak. In fact, Mubarak's CAF, Morsi, and post-Morsi Egypt, essentially when you look at the budget structure of the state, it's exactly the same. The basic, even though there is polarization around the question of religion and its relation to politics, but when you look really more in depth, you find that the continuity is, even on this issue, is much, much more profound than the rupture. Now, the failure, I think, also of what we might call the revolutionary camp to convince the population at large, after 3 years of continuous struggle with all the sacrifices it entailed, that there is a certain, let's say, light at the end of the tunnel, or a certain perspective for a strategy for change and how to gain them. The failure to do this, I think, has also very much played an important role in explaining why there is this revolutionary fatigue, and why, therefore, in the population there is a mood calling for stability. And therefore, the mass media, which is quite reactionary, about against the revolution, glorifying the state, arguing that it is under threat from terrorism and so on, all this is particularly influential on public opinion because there is a mood among people that this revolutionary struggle has to end somehow and that it did not lead to anything. Now, we have witnessed throughout this process many surprises, and especially mood swings, violent mood swings in public opinion. So it won't surprise me if within a few months from now, El Sisi, who is now considered as a hero with all this cult of personality and so on, loses tremendously his popularity. But it's not inevitable also. And here it is, I think, important to look at not only the state structurally as an instrument of class power and so on, but also to look at the state really from the inside. The state, despite its class character, is not a monolith. And I think that an important element explaining why even the limited gain that was achieved with Mubarak's ouster, which is not very limited, but it's limited in the historic perspective, in the sense that there have been continuity after him. But still, very few people could have imagined that ousting Mubarak in revolutionary mobilization was possible, even a few months before it happened. So, but one reason why this gain was achieved was that there were also within the state important divisions. It is often said that the military in Egypt is the backbone of the state. And this is largely true. But despite the fact that it is largely true, it is true also that in the last few decades, the army has been relatively this is a dictatorship, and within a dictatorship, the instruments of repression are important, particularly important. So within what one might call the power block in Egypt, this tripartite power block with the military, the security apparatus, and the political apparatus, the balance of power has clearly shifted towards the police. This became really a police state maybe since the mid-70s, while it used to be a military-dominated state, I think essentially up to 1967, and then with the catastrophic results of the war, the shift started to take place. And without going into details, the army had many grievances with Sadat and Mubarak. And even the so-called military-industrial complex, the huge economic empire and so on, I think there is lots of exaggeration in this. There are, of course, huge privileges for the military, but compared to the police, for instance, they feel that they have been marginalized. Not only in terms of privileges, but also in terms of the influence of the institution. At many levels, the army wanted to get rid of Mubarak, and they felt that the uprising was an occasion to be seized. But of course, the amount of change they wanted to introduce was limited. I think they might have been interested, and this can be a subject for debate, I can elaborate on this more in the discussion. They might have been interested in more radical change, between brackets, than they did. One reason why they couldn't do is that they were aware that the scale of economic problems, the social inequality, the political deprivation, and the level of popular mobilization, they were afraid of democracy, even if at some levels I think that they had an interest to realize one of the demands of the revolution, that was to restructure the Ministry of Interior. This was in the interest of the military. If they didn't do it, it is because they were afraid of a certain democratic momentum that might go out of hands. And this is, I think, part of the predicament we are living now, because clearly it is clear that even important democratic change, let alone changing the whole social structure, is clearly requiring a huge mobilization from below, not only huge and large, but one that really converges the political and the social. I think that the revolutionary process in Egypt lacked in depth what it had maybe in width or in breadth. Now, I'll just conclude by the question of what is to be done. Part of the really hugely disappointing situation now is that much of the left has accepted, more or less, even if a little bit critically, but more or less accepted the current arrangement. They have accepted the notion that the war on terror is the general climate, the general really slogan appropriate to the era, with all the consequences that you must know with the war on terror here. I think on this question of war on terror, we need, I don't have the time to elaborate on this now. Yes, I do? Okay. Okay, I'll just mention one remark on this notion of the war on terror, to be also for us to think about it. I think we have here to distinguish between what is mythical about it from what is real, and also to look at what is paradoxical about it. So it is mythical in the sense that, you know, when you declare an organization, a huge political organization, which, like the Muslim Brotherhood, which for the last 3 decades has been really an essential player of the power of the political game in Egypt, which has been really integrated in many ways in the regime politically and socially. And I think the Brotherhood are deeply reactionary and extremely problematic, and I think that their role is largely also a factor in explaining the current counter-revolutionary mood in the country. So I'll be the last one to defend the Brotherhood politically. This being said, to describe them as terrorists is absurd. I mean, they are not, and actually they are not many of the things that are being described today. This being said, they are, and elements on their fringes and allies and so on are using terror. But more importantly, there is at another level, and I don't think it's controlled at all by the Brotherhood or by elements of them, there is genuine terrorism, and we do see it in Sinai today. In fact, over the last 2 weeks, qualitative developments have taken place at this level. So in Sinai, for the first time, a helicopter has been shot down by a missile, a surface-to-air missile. Outside Sinai, in Cairo, in the gates of Cairo security headquarters has been bombed by a car bomb, detonated. And more recently, 10 days ago, a senior interior Interior Ministry official has been gunned down in broad daylight. Now, these, together with the scale of violent activities of different sorts, have increased a lot. So, in this sense, while, and in fact, they are very much benefiting to the government. I mean, I don't know of any example of a government that has been toppled by terrorist activity. So, on the one hand, it is increasing fear in the population, and therefore increasing the popularity of El-Sisi, the notion of him being the hero, saving the country, and so on. At the same time, by attributing falsely, I think, to the Brotherhood, there is justification of a massive increase in repression, which is not only targeting the Brotherhood, but targeting the Brotherhood and the revolutionary forces and the revolution as such. This being said, what I want to say is that what is paradoxical really about it is that when you look at, in the narrow sense, terrorist acts, they are increasingly sophisticated. Increasingly, you have jihadists who have been well trained in different parts of the world and who have combat experience, who went back to Egypt with the availability of arms coming from Libya and from everywhere. So there is increasing sophistication in terrorist acts in the narrow sense. But at the same time, the Brotherhood, to whom all this is attributed, totally wrongly, are actually getting more and more isolated. And this is important to understand also, because while many people in the left, unfortunately, in Egypt, have actually surrendered to the regime under the banner that we have to get rid of the Brotherhood, there is another not very popular position in the left, but I think from my standpoint it's equally erroneous, arguing that we have today to show total unity with the Brotherhood in their struggle against the state. And I think this is not only incorrect. I mean, it is one thing, of course, to defend the Brotherhood, and we have to do it against all sorts of human rights abuses and against all sorts of also campaigns, lying campaigns and so on. This is one thing, and to argue that politically the left and the revolutionary forces should unite with them is another. Since the ouster of Morsi, the content of the Brotherhood's agitation and propaganda against the state has been tremendously reactionary. It is increasingly also, because they do feel that they are isolated from the population, it is increasingly directed against the people as such. One slogan I heard in Cairo in a demonstration by the Brotherhood in a popular quarter 3 weeks ago is quite revealing. They were marching in the midst of people's indifference, and they were angered at this indifference. So the slogan was, "We will liberate you despite your will." This was the slogan that, and this is not actually exceptional. I mean, in general, the politics of the Brotherhood today has developed this, of course, under also lots of pressure to which they are subjected, but they are part of the global hysteria in the country. So if there is this anti-Brotherhood hysteria, they also have a kind of suicidal attitude to politics in which they are really, I mean, on the one hand, recognizing explicitly sometimes that they are isolated from public opinion, but at the same time insisting that they are leading a revolutionary struggle against the regime to topple it and so on. And while they are not terrorists, but of course, they think also that they can benefit from the kind of terrorist actions that take place specifically in Sinai, and they are sometimes condemning them, but not really wholeheartedly, and therefore they participate really in creating a climate which is really not conducive at all to progressive politics. So I think the situation is really difficult. The left, I think, needs to combine clarity about the fact that the Brotherhood are not an alternative, and that we do need a strategic alternative to dictatorship in Egypt, whether it is military-led or religious, while at the same time refusing the narrative of war on terrorism, because in reality, and despite the sophistication I mentioned of certain terrorist acts, but because these are extremely isolated, they are not whatsoever a threat to the security of the state as they are represented. This being said, I think that what would change the situation is first that the revolutionary camp needs to understand that today it is a small minority. And of course, all the contradictions that led to the revolution are there, and therefore the revolutionary process is still there. There have not been a crashing defeat for the revolution, despite the violence of the state and despite the tragedy of the Brotherhood's account in power. But we are in a bad moment, in a bad turn, but things can change. But for things to change, it is important, I think it is fundamental for both for the revolutionary left in the limited sense of the term, and for the wider left or the left of the revolution in general, this in the sense of people protesting really for social and political change. It is important to understand that first, there must be ways of convincing public opinion that the stability they are seeking with all the promises of welfare and so on, that the regime will not deliver on these, and that in fact democratic gains, even limited democratic gains, are possible, but they have to be gained by revolutionary means. And that revolutionary means also do not necessarily mean chaos and protestations all the time, but I think that a narrative explaining in a convincing way that reform and revolutionary means and reform of the sort that open the floor for further radicalization is a possibility. It seems to me that the left is polarized between a majority which has really sold, what's the term, sold out totally, and therefore for whom the notion of strategy is not relevant at all, and a minority of genuine revolutionaries, mostly associated, I think, with the far left, with the Trotskyists of different sorts, who are not very influential, but who are there and who are very brave, but who have, I think, a huge lack of strategy and tactics beyond the general principled revolutionary positions. Thank you.
So we'll open it up to Q&A. Again, we ask that you be mindful. We're trying to allow everyone a chance to ask their question or make their comment. We'll give people 3 minutes. We'll also be showing some street art that has popped up around Egypt. It's anti-regime street art. It's become a very a form of expression against the regimes, all the regimes. And you'll see one thing that they did is that they did a lot of, I guess, tributes to martyrs of the regime. So you'll see them. Andy, do you want to come and?
She's asked me to take over the hand. Colleague, brother there.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for coming to talk with us. I have like a bunch of questions, but I guess I'll stick with a short one, and that is, what is, obviously there's been like a development in like the women's struggle. There's been like small self-defense communities. There's been training in martial arts. This is some of the things I've seen. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, have there been like major theoretical developments? Have like these, like, if you want to call them feminist sensibilities that you see in popular square. I'm trying to get like more of a broader, but concrete feel for how that's developed.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll take a couple more.
I had a question about the
yes.
Question about the internal life and the Federation of Independent Trade Unions. Because I know that many of the leaders have been pro-Sisi, but is there an active debate, argument going on inside the Federation? Is there any kind of organized group? I mean, I'm sure some of the far left socialists that you refer to are speaking up, but is there any kind of broader grouping within the independent federation that is opposing the development, the line of the leadership?
Hi, thanks. My name is Evelyn. I'm with the League of the Revolutionary Party. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I don't have revolutionary direct experience, obviously, like the people in revolutionary socialists and others who have been jailed or worse in Egypt, and as Omar pointed out, have acted very courageously. Nevertheless, I think I'm just going to make some points and end with the question. In Egypt, there has not been, to my understanding, a clear and consistent message coming from the revolutionary left. Admittedly, as Omar mentioned, small influence, historically in society and still. But nevertheless, there has not been an intransigent message of the need to smash the pro-imperialist capitalist state as the only way to achieve real democracy, to create a worker state, and that this requires the building of independent working class organization and a revolutionary party, calling for an alliance between the working class and all the oppressed, something that the unions on their own cannot do, create this vision of the entire society. In fact, the revolutionary socialists called for a vote for Morsi in the last election, if I'm correct, and I think that was a terrible mistake. It seemed to me that an active boycott was the right thing to do, and to argue that, I need more than 3 minutes, but I wanted to put it out there. There's not been a consistent counterforce to the great illusions in the people to control the army, simply through everlasting mass pressure. And what was needed, and probably still is needed, is the strategy for mass armed self-defense of the revolution, in part achieved through active efforts to win over the ranks of the conscript army. Using strikes and mass struggles that have occurred to advocate launching workers of the popular and army rank-and-file councils to begin proposing alternative government. I know that the revolutionary socialists have raised a number of these ideas at times, but my criticism is that they haven't been raised consistently, and I see that as the key to building a revolutionary party.
Start to wrap up.
In Egypt. Yes, I will. I have a question. Thanks, Andy. My question has to do with today, and has to do with the conjuncture, and how, if at all, is it possible to win over, for revolutionary and democratic-minded workers in youth today, how is it possible to win over the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood, if it is possible? And I know that during the initial revolution of 2011, the youth of them tended to break away, and I'm wondering what the possibilities are today.
Okay, concerning feminist sensibility, I think it's a hugely important question. And I have the same impression as you. There are, you know, the question of, I mean, the oppression of women in general, but in particular, the sexual harassment has been a terrible development of the pre-revolution years, and unfortunately has increased even after the revolution. It has not increased because spontaneously men are attacking women sexually. It has increased because in the context of the revolutionary upheaval, all sorts of abuses were possible also. So much of the increase that happened after the revolution started was instigated by the regime, by above. By thugs associated with the police, sometimes with CAF, sometimes with the Muslim Brotherhood. But of course, it is extremely alarming, and there has been, in reaction, a very promising movement of mostly women, but also revolutionary men who are actively and with lots of creativity resisting sexual harassment, exposing it, doing propaganda against it, but also resisting it physically in public transports, in Tahrir Square when it was taking place there. But I think you're right that there hasn't been, except in limited circles, a feminist discourse of significant feminist narrative, exposing it, linking it to other aspects, other problematic aspects of the social and political order. And I think this is a huge subject. I mean, it's part and parcel. Things of the sort, developing them qualitatively is part and parcel of this capacity, which is lacking today, that I mentioned, of the workers' movement, for instance, to have an agenda for society as large. So I think it's very important. Now, the debates inside the federation, I'm not, you know, there are 3 independent labor union federations.
Is there a part? I just want to follow. Is there in a sense, are at least like informal shifts in gender sensibilities, even if they're not explicit?
Yes, definitely. I think, I mean, it is clear that for women's consciousness about it and about resisting it has increased. And I mean, you find this among all sorts of women, including veiled women and so on. The notion, for instance, that was quite dominant, that women are responsible, they are provoking it and so on, has really been sidelined. I think that part of the, for instance, of the current anti-brotherhood hysteria is that increasingly women who are totally veiled, you know, who are wearing the niqab, are actually abused systematically in certain areas because they are associated with Islamist militants and so on. So interestingly, these circles who are the most reactionary vis-a-vis the women question had to raise the issue. Sometimes in a contradictory way, that how come we veiled women be exposed to this could, as if this would be okay if it is for non-veiled women. But then to be more consistent, they had to adjust, in fact, and therefore you have lots of, I mean, on Facebook you have tens of, maybe hundreds of groups doing tremendous work and very popular in mobilizing against it and raising consciousness against it and so on. But I'm not aware of, as I said, of the existence of, you know, the mood in the country is still quite conservative. And even though some, you know, some of the leftists who are pro-regime were arguing that maybe with this huge popular mobilization against brotherhood, well, okay, we will do concessions to the army and so on, but we will gain in the sense of that we will secularize the regime and so on. But it is not happening because, of course, an important part of the pro-Sisi alliance is Islamists, or are Islamists, who are even more reactionary than the Brotherhood, the Salafists, and they have their own agenda. So, for instance, the new constitution, the current constitution, after the amendments of the Morsi constitution, I think on this issue, on the question of freedoms in general, it is better than that of the Brotherhood, but not qualitatively better. It is still framed within a general conservative state of mind, including sexism, but it's not emphasizing the family as the Morsi constitution used to do. But the difference is not really qualitative. So I think much remains to be done at this level. Concerning the labor movement, in addition to the Federation of Independent Trade Unions, there are 2 other labor union federations. The Independent Federation, the one Fatma is associated with, is important because it was the one, it is still the largest one, and the one created in the midst of the revolution. I mean, it was really created on the 1st of February, so 2011, so before even Mubarak's ouster. And it is the largest, but because it is the largest also, I think in many ways it's the most conservative and bureaucratized. So according to discussions I had with people who are involved in this, the bulk of the unions are extremely militant. I mean, they are, despite the fact that they are not legalized, so they have really huge financial problems and so on, but they are really leading the bulk of these thousands of protests I mentioned about. They are militant on the ground, but with a very narrow focus, more often than not. While the federation, as such, is, it is increasingly dominated by the kind of very conservative trade unionism that has always been dominant in the official federation in Egypt. In part, this is because of the anti-strike climate in the country. Everybody in the media, not only businessmen, is arguing that the economy is suffering terribly because of the strikes, which is not at all true, because actually, when you look even at the statistics, the effect of strikes on production is minimal compared to so many other factors. But of course, the climate is such that the notion that the wheel of production, this expression became very famous, has to turn quickly and so on, has become very dominant, especially with the current nationalism. So, for instance, someone like Fatma Ramadan is in a small minority now in the leadership of the federation. But it is a minority that is important because it can relate more to the mood of the grassroots. Now, I agree that there are problems, huge problems of strategy and strategic clarity of the revolutionary left. Concerning the support by the revolutionary socialists of Morsi, well, this, I think it was a mistake, but it's not as tragic a mistake as we might think. Remember, this was at the second stage when the choice was between really Morsi and the representative of the regime and the army, Shafik, who was the last prime minister of Mubarak. So it was a terribly difficult choice. I do agree that boycotting was best. The argument today of the revolutionary socialists is that at least those of them who still believe that it was correct to support Morsi reluctantly in the second round is to say that, well, it was better for the revolution, for the Brotherhood to be exposed in power as a continuity of the regime, and that in this sense this was a good choice, and that had we had Shafik as president, maybe the demoralization would have been huge already. It's difficult, but anyway, there is clearly one big mistake that the revolutionary socialists took when they took this decision. They took it too early. Early when the results of the first round appeared, and so the second round became known as between Morsi and Shafik, many progressive forces were negotiating with Morsi and the Brotherhood, trying to put pressure either on Morsi giving a commitment for certain pro-revolution policies and so on before we vote for you, or another position was for Morsi actually to withdraw, and in this case the person who was third, who is Hamdin Sabahi, a left Nasrist, who was regarded as someone who would have, and I think correctly, much more capacity at that stage in mid-2012 to mobilize opinion against the counter-revolution, and therefore to gain without all the ambiguity related and problems related to the Brotherhood. So you had these two positions putting pressure on the Brotherhood, and the revolutionary socialists proclaimed their support for Morsi before anybody. So I think this, at the level of timing, it was catastrophic, really. But generally speaking, to go to the question of revolutionary propaganda, I think, you mentioned that the revolutionary socialists and actually others in the revolutionary left have, a lot has been written about deepening the revolution, about workers' councils, about popular committees, about linking different struggles and so on. I think that the problem here is not really about raising these issues at the level of propaganda, but it's about believing that in fact this is not a zero-sum game. And here perhaps we might disagree, but I believe that what was needed was to say that, not to be totally obsessed by the model of the Russian Revolution necessarily, to argue that these grassroots forms of organization are necessary even to gain limited democratic demands that people are convinced of, because more often than not, revolutionary narrative seemed extremely abstract to the population. And then another thing is that within the workers' movement, I think an important mistake, now it's no longer, I mean, it's not relevant now because it's no longer done, but an important mistake at the height of the revolution at the beginning was that the revolutionary socialists in particular, I think, had, I mean, they had clarity about the need for a workers' party that is large, a mass party, but at the same time militant party based on the working class. But instead of focusing on the normal, I would say, climate in which you could struggle for this, that is the new trade unions, independent unions, the new federation of independent unions and so on, as a locus of this possibility, they in fact created a party that they called the Workers' Democratic Party that seemed extremely sectarian and isolated and so on, and at a timing when really this could have mattered. This being said, the revolutionary socialists and the whole far left compared to the working class is really a very tiny minority. So we shouldn't also exaggerate their capacity to change things. I mean, there is a huge problem of depoliticization. This is a historic heritage of the Egyptian working class, and it's not easy to overcome it just by having the correct slogans.
Omar, to take up that argument again about whether the revolutionary socialists were wrong just in timing or whatever, you gave by the way, I want to say your talk was really quite fascinating and very nuanced, and you made very clear that the various different transitions of the regime were the same regime. And therefore, it was absolutely necessary for the maybe tiny handful of revolutionaries who recognized that fact to make that fact absolutely clear. And therefore, any kind of support for Morsi, whether delayed or partial or even corrected afterwards, is really a dangerous mistake, because they should have taken the opportunity to say there is this class line, and every one of these candidates is the class enemy. And now nobody may have believed them when they said this, and there may have been many people who had hopes that Morsi would be a more open regime and more opportunities for the working class. Nevertheless, it was under the circumstances that you described, it was absolutely necessary to draw this line, and not only against Morsi, but also against the military coup that took place, because revolutionaries were also very confused and ambiguous about that. Some saying it was not a coup and it was a result of the democratic. Well, of course, it was a response to the democratic movement, but it was a counter-revolutionary response. And that had to be clear, that there is the class difference between all wings of the regime and the masses of people, and particularly with the working class.
I have a few different questions, so I'll just say them really quickly. And one of them is somewhat similar to what I think Walter mentioned. So I was just wondering if there's been as much debate about the left's support of the Mubarak movement as there has been in regards to their support for Morsi in the elections. I mean, I know that there was a moment that they broke away, but it seemed that many people could foresee what was sort of taking place and what people are saying about that. And then that leads me to think about, so some of us who understand the Brotherhood in Egypt and elsewhere in the region, also, and this could be a false understanding, but we also understand their constituency to sometimes be a separate entity than its leadership. No doubt it's a reactionary hierarchical organization, but people are attached to these movements through family, through their beliefs. And it feels that, and maybe I'm overestimating this, but it feels like that there is a generation of young people who are feeling alienated by this sort of rejection of anything Islamicist, which is now being reverberated all over the region, not just, who are potential revolutionaries. And then, I don't mean to sort of just keep hammering in the labor question, but as you said, it's still small but very significant. And I was just wondering, Kamal Abou-Elka's appointment, what that has meant, if it means nothing, if it means something, And then I was hearing also something in terms of disagreement with the Center for Trade Union and Worker Services, and also the role that they're playing. And then lastly, what do you think about Sabahi's campaign, if it's worth thinking about at all?
One thing, actually, people should actually pick up Adam Hania's Lineages of Revolt. It's a tremendous book that just came out in the New Market that helps go through, help us think through some of these questions quite constructively, in my opinion. I guess a question and just a notion about some of what we like to hear in solidarity. It's not as though we in New York are alien to the notion of mass hysteria, the response that New York had, well, the response that New York has had every day. But in particular after 9/11, you know, in this city of all places, to see the flags go up and that kind of thing. But I think what still remains kind of extraordinary, even for those of us on the left, is to see the kind of mobilization that took millions into the street, the bravery, all the things that we all saw play out from 2011 on, then revert to including some of those same individuals, because it's not like all of those millions were sidelined and new millions have come into replace, but actually some of those same millions who took to the streets became politicized, went on strike, formed independent unions, are among those who are touting this line. So if you could maybe get beneath that a little bit more about what accounts for that and how fragile, and you even mentioned to some degree some of the superficiality. I will say this in terms of, frankly, not in defense of what the revolutionary socialist position has been on this. I disagree with them as well as other voices here in terms of the election and certain things. I do believe their understanding of some of their positioning was to not cut themselves off from some of the youth of the Muslim Brotherhood whom they've been collaborating with literally on the streets and fighting alongside of, and saw themselves trying to figure out ways and of being in cahoots with the very people in the midst of this sort of wave. And I think that among the lessons for us here and internationally on the revolutionary left is how in the heat of battle and in the heat of these kinds of moments, people who are well seasoned about the understanding of the class character of organizations, in this case, like the Brotherhood, can get pulled into making what are really mistakes to where varying degrees of importance one can only gauge from a greater distance than we currently have in time. But I think that these are not simple questions. We can't just simply say these people stood here precisely because of what Suzanne described. There's the institution of the Brotherhood or various other entities we're more familiar, and then there's the masses that follow them. And in the heat of battle, what that actually looks like and how you win over sections of that is not cannot be written down in some blueprint ahead of time. No. Oh, we should say something about the, if you don't mind, about the statement, the solidarity statement. We can send it out to all those who signed up here to sign on themselves, the Egypt Solidarity Campaign statement for global solidarity with the brothers and sisters there.
Okay, I agree with you, Walter, on the question that given the basic sameness and continuity of the regime, there should be no illusions about a certain manifestation of it, either by regarding the Muslim Brotherhood as a revolutionary or a progressive force, or regarding the military Sisi as a savior of the country. All these are extremely dangerous and mistaken positions. But my nuance was already said by Sherry, in that the difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and other manifestations of the regime, such as SCAF, even though I think, I might be mistaken, but I think that the military is not really identical to the Mubarak regime, but it is an important part of the state. The difference is that the Brotherhood is a huge mass organization. And of course, it's not a monolith. I mean, if the state is not a monolith, so the Brotherhood more so. In fact, we did witness over the last 3 years several important splits within the ranks of the Brotherhood, sometimes provoked by the left in great ways. For instance, there was this first, I think it was 6 months after the beginning of the revolution, what was called then the Egyptian current, Tayar al-Masri, that came out of the Brotherhood and had, generally speaking, in the wide sense of the term, a social democratic leftist orientation. And in fact, it participated in the parliamentary elections in a wider coalition that was led by the left, and even though it scored very modestly, but still it sent 9 or 10 deputies to parliament, and more importantly, in the process itself, it really raised political consciousness during the electoral campaigns and so on. And so an element of the Muslim Brotherhood youth in this Egyptian current was part of this. Another more significant split happened with the supporters of a former very important leader of the Brotherhood and ex-presidential candidate, Abdelmenem al-Futuh. This is called Strong Egypt. You will notice that much of the notion of Strong Egypt and the Egyptian current, and Egyptian nationalism is unfortunately very, very dominant among liberals, leftists, Islamists, and so these names tend to be repeated. But anyway, this party is more significant, Strong Egypt, because it's more grassroots. It's a more important split from the Brotherhood, and it's much more wider. Because, it has liberal and leftist components, and today it is an important part of, I think, a promising, I think the most promising coalition, revolutionary in the wide sense of the term, which is the Revolution Pass Front. So at least the left of this party is very active in it. So all this is just to say that we shouldn't, with Islamists, dismiss everybody. And I think personally it is something to be hoped for that, if it happens, it's a big if, but if it happens that a certain genuinely leftist incarnation of Islamism, and by this I mean really something progressive, something which is unequivocally progressive on the women question, on freedoms of different sorts, on freedom of belief and so on. If something of the sort emerged, because even Masr Qawiya and Tayar al-Masri and so on did not really, they avoided such issues. If something of the sort developed, it would be a huge step forward. And I think that the left should struggle at this level. An important reason why, the revolutionary socialists in Egypt are all the time accused by everybody else in the left of being, secretly allied to the Brotherhood and so on, because of something that is, I think, very positive, which is that the revolutionary left in Egypt since the early 90s was consciously trying to break this catastrophic tendency of the left in the name of anti-obscurantism, of allying with the authoritarian state and therefore discrediting itself, and actually paradoxically opening the door for the Islamists as the genuine opposition. Now, it might be true that sometimes the revolutionary socialists have bended the stick a little bit too far by actually sometimes giving the impression that the Brotherhood are actually progressive. But these were, mistakes that happened, but it was not a principled issue. In general, the Brotherhood, the revolutionary socialists were clear that the Brotherhood is a very contradictory phenomenon, that their leadership is reactionary, but that we are trying to reach to their mass base, and that sometimes, of course, we can also, in the logic of the United Front, have limited alliances with them while keeping our independence on specific issues like campaigns against torture, sometimes against globalization and so on. So I think this was the general tendency, and I think it was basically correct. With all its mistakes, it's much, much, much better than the catastrophic pro-dictatorship attitude of the bulk of the Stalinist left. And, I didn't mention anything about Tamarrud. I'm sorry about that. Tamarrud, for maybe you all know, but it means rebellion, and this was the name of the famous campaign that was calling for early presidential elections and was actually really at the origin of this mobilization against Morsi. Now, rebellion as a movement is very problematic. it might be true, as there are lots of rumors that it was absolutely manipulated by, you know, the intelligence services and so on. This might be true. I don't think it is true, but even if it is not true, it is true that ideologically, you know, these were essentially Nasserist youth, and Nasserism has always been, you know, I mean, Nasserism as a movement historically emanated from the army, and Nasserism as a current in Egypt today is very much pro-army, including the left Nasserists like Hamdin Sabbahi, even if he now tries to distance himself a little bit from the pro-Sisi hysteria, and he might be candidate for the presidential elections. We will see. It will be announced the next few weeks. But in general, Nasserists are easily manipulated by the army and the intelligence services when it comes to, in particular, taking anti-Islamist standpoints and so on. This being said, I think what was really problematic about Tamarrud was not what it said, or even its manipulation, if it was there. What was problematic is that, as I tried to explain, the climate in the country in general was, you know, people are tired. Yes, they hugely mobilized against the Brotherhood, but it was not at all the same mood as the mobilization against Mubarak. I mean, people were in a genuine revolution against Mubarak, not only against Mubarak, they wanted change in general, and they were being radicalized. They knew also that they could face tremendous risks, and you know, many people lost their lives and so on. While it was clear in the few weeks before 30 June that almost the whole state apparatus was against Morsi. So you did not, I mean, those who went out on 30 June did not face the danger of being repressed by the state. Yes, they faced the danger maybe of being repressed by pro-Brotherhood militias and so on, but generally speaking, they felt they are protected not just by the army, but by the police also. So already there was something, let us say, initially corrupt or initially problematic, at least in the Tamarrud campaign. This being said, many of the masses who supported it were doing it. I mean, Tamarrud could mean everything to different people. It meant for some people genuinely continuing the revolution and looking at Morsi as a continuation of Mubarak and of SCAF. For others, they were offended by the extreme inefficiency and reactionary discourse of the Brotherhood, especially in the last 6 months before Morsi's ouster, without thinking in terms, I mean, people who have been indifferent to the revolution, not hostile, but who are mobilized specifically on an anti-Muslim Brotherhood agenda. For others, they were actually considering the Brotherhood as the main product and incarnation of the revolution, and in fact, they were looking forward to restore the old regime. So you had these three currents in I mean, you had, it is true that there were tens of millions of people who mobilized on that day, and the ideological confusion was extreme, I think. Whether it was true to support this or not, I think that it was inevitable for the left to be part of it, but maybe in a more critical mindset. Because, I mean, there was, even within the revolutionary left, lots of illusions. I mean, when you look at the press of the revolutionary left during the few days after 30 June, I mean, it was huge celebration. Even when the army ousted Morsi, yes, there were lots of you know, talk, I mean, warning that the army has other intentions and so on, but this was said in a way that lacked conviction, lacked clarity. So clearly there were illusions among everybody, I think, about the army at that. I want also to highlight something, that also the Brotherhood's discourse, really, and it was very clear during these days leading to the 30 June, was extremely scary. I mean, they were, I mean, one part of the tragedy of the Muslim Brotherhood is that they talk much more violently than they act, actually. So at all levels. So this is why it's easy to accuse them of being terrorists, because they always have a double discourse. So, but what they were saying in the days leading to 30 June, basically is that we are the huge majority, and that you are a small minority, and that we will crush you, and we will crush you with the support of the army and the police. They didn't have the support of the army or the police, but they were claiming they have it. The army was extremely ambiguous in its discourse until the last few days, actually. But anyway, it wasn't very, I mean, it's very easy today in retrospect and in New York to criticize the lack of clarity and so on. But you know, these were decisions taken in absolutely difficult circumstances, and more specifically, unfortunately, in a generally conservative climate. I mean, this is paradoxical because you had huge mobilizations, but people mobilizing for stability, basically. You know, one important, very conservative also, but popular Egyptian journalist, TV journalist, had during the last months of Morsi this slogan that I would love for Egypt to be a backward third world country. And by this he meant that we are now declining from being a third world country to perhaps being a failed state totally and so on. And this had lots of echo in the population. So people were mobilizing in huge numbers, but at the same time for stability. And I think that when you look at the history of revolutionary mobilizations, this happens sometimes. So it wasn't easy, but of course, clarity is important, and I think more importantly, to gain the clarity, I mean, it's not, the important thing now is the future, so it's very important to look at the lessons of these issues and to understand the basic continuity in the regime, but also to manage, and this is where I think things are lacking, to think concretely about what is to be done in a way that can be convincing to people, because now the danger really, I think, facing the future of this revolution is that there is a general image of the activists, of the revolutionary, as someone who wants absolute chaos with total lack of perspective, people who are just orgasmic about revolting and protesting all the time with no agenda and so on. Now, not to mention, of course, all the accusations of treason to the state, you know, 6 April movement being, you know, trained in Serbia by anti-Egypt. You know, Egypt is one of those countries also, and I think this applies to certain big countries, so, you know, countries like Russia, like Germany, where it is easy for nationalism to be extreme. So the notion of the whole world conspirating against Egypt, and of course, you know, the Middle East is a part of the world where imperialism has been so dominant. So conspiracy theories are easily popular in this region. And I think we need to take this into account, for instance, in criticism of the army. I mean, I think that clearly SCAF should be criticized, El-Sisi, we have to expose their counter-revolutionary, authoritarian politics and so on. But it is important also to understand, you know, here I am thinking of, you know, the notion in someone like Gramsci, for instance, of hegemony and the struggle for ideas, and how to look at the contradictions of the common sense of popular opinion as something really contradictory. So, for instance, you know, this notion that in the common sense, even reactionary common sense of the dominant ideology, there might be some good sense. So within the support for the army today, there is lots of hysteria, lots of mythology really and so on. But there is also something potentially we can relate to, which is the desire, you know, the nostalgia for the Nasser, the social justice and the anti-imperialist gains really of the Nasser era, the feeling of glory, of liberation and so on. And I think that the revolutionary left is not sensitive enough to these. I mean, instead of saying that we want to dismantle the army, as it was often said, I mean, first of all, the notion, I mean, the strategic notion that you want to dismantle the state is only relevant when you have really organs of dual power and so on. And this has not been the case in Egypt. So it's not really necessary to put these on the agendas as if they are immediate questions. This is one thing. But the other thing is that you can also be sensitive to the question of imperialism when addressing the military issue by saying, for instance, that we are for an anti-imperialist stance, but we think that actually authoritarianism is incompatible with it, and therefore you manage to relate really to some element of what is being said in the dominant discourse. Sorry, I've been...
That's all right. We have time for one more round. Matt. And...
Thanks. My name's Matt. I'm also from the League for the Revolutionary Party. I think Suzanne raised the question of whether there's a rethinking around the Tamarod movement, the sections of the left which supported it. I know from friends on the left in Egypt and what I'm reading that there's not really enough. Partly, as Omar and as others would know, partly because so much of the left is supporting the military, but there's also a great reluctance from those who are opposing the military very bravely, like the revolutionary socialists, to rethink their support for the Tamarod campaign and its leaders, to the point where RS leaders, who I have a lot of respect for, continue to publish articles saying that the masses overthrew Morsi, rather than, obviously, the military did. The military took advantage of the mass movement, which they had played a role in encouraging, but they conducted a coup. At the time of the coup, these leftists were celebrating a second revolution, as opposed to what was clearly a counter-revolutionary move by the military. And when it gets to the point that you confuse revolution and counter-revolution, we know that the confusion has gone very, very, very deep, and a very serious rethinking needs to take place. With the Tamarod movement, I mean, I think it exposes a big mistake that leftists can make, which is cheerleading a movement and not criticizing the leaders and challenging the leaders of a movement. Because I've certainly experienced a familiar response to revolutionaries who raise criticisms of leaders and difficult questions as being kind of party poopers, crazy sectarians. We had it in the case of, we had in the case of the Tamarod movement, a movement whose eldest leader was known to be a collaborator with military intelligence before the coup. Leftists knew this. Leftists were talking about it. It was obvious that Falul, remnants of the regime, were funding and encouraging Tamarod. At the same time that Tamarod was pretending to be part of the revolution. They were pretending just to be for new elections and so forth. But all they had to do was be challenged. Why won't you also say, no return to military rule? We demand you say this. And then they were refused and they would be exposed for refusing to do this. But instead, it was friendly relations with the Tamarod leaders, to the point where even the revolutionary socialists, you can see on YouTube, invited the leaders to their own meetings to speak, free of all sorts of any criticism whatsoever. It's tragic. I mean, comrades we know, we can see in the video, hosting with perfect friendship, these people who were clearly collaborating. Now, briefly, it's certainly true that it's very difficult to make up a correct revolutionary policy as you go in the heat of a revolution, sometimes when you're getting shot at. It's why, just like you need a compass to make your way around, you need a revolutionary strategy clearly from the beginning. And I think that the tragedy of the Egyptian revolution at this point confirms the theory of permanent revolution, that the bourgeoisie in the third world countries is too weak to tolerate democracy. We've seen first the Muslim Brotherhood join with the military to try to put an end to the revolution. Now the Nasserists and the rest of the bourgeoisie joining with the military to end the revolution. It was necessary from the outset to understand that either the working class would become the leadership of this revolution and overthrow and achieve democracy by overthrowing capitalist rule itself, or it would be exhausted and defeated. There's still a lot of hope for the Egyptian revolution, but these, I think, are key lessons.
Separation of the economic struggle from the political struggle, where I tended to kind of simplify it and think, well, the revolution, they're demanding freedom, democracy, and economic gains, a better life. So my question is, in all of this working class struggle in industry, where there've been these waves of strikes going on and on, what kind of attitude do many of these workers have? Like, there's no such thing as an average worker, but what is the tendency in terms of their attitude towards politics Are they anti-political in sort of a syndicalist way of saying we're only interested in the union struggle? Are they, you know, what is their attitude towards Islamist, you know, movements? Or in the question like that Evelyn had raised about winning over the ranks of the Brotherhood, to what extent does the Brotherhood have any kind of base among the same workers that have been striking? Things like that. What is their attitude about imperialism? You know, are they, and nationalism, you know, Nasserism and all those things. I understand that Marxism has been widely discredited for, you know, obvious historical reasons, and, you know, so I think that's one reason why Marxist revolutionaries are isolated, you know, and find it so difficult even to find a compass because they're trying to break through to the masses. So.
Okay, last question.
I think this has been a very interesting discussion. I really appreciate the interweaving of the ideas of freedom and concretizing them, as you brought out the importance of having the right, quote, the right, or change, being willing to change ideas as the circumstances change and looking deeper beyond. So I find this very interesting, and with that in mind, I'd just like to invite everybody here to come to News and Letters for discussions starting tomorrow evening. We've ordered only an inch of snow, so that shouldn't be a problem, at the Commons in Brooklyn. And if you want to fly or want to know more, me and Michael will be happy to talk to you.
Okay, I think I will start with the last question about the limitations of and the consciousness of workers. And in this, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention something about Abu Aita and to reply to Susan. So it ties together. Actually, you know, look at this at Kamal Abu Aita. It's a very important example. Kamal Abu Aita is a Nasrist, but a left Nasrist. He is a product of, you know, the so-called vanguard organization of Nasserism in the 1960s, which had lots of, you know, leftist discourse, but in a context of an extremely I mean, this vanguard organization was part of the ruling party, the only party actually, the Arab Socialist Union, which was really more, among other things, a security apparatus also of the regime. So something full of contradictions. Anyway, but he is a left Nasrist, and for the last 10 years or so, he has been a great activist as also a worker leader, and in fact, he helped establishing the first and the only independent trade union before the revolution in 2007 among real estate tax workers or employees, and someone with lots of respect and credentials and so on. But he comes from this Nasserist tradition, which in fact, I mean, you know, Nasser was at one and the same time the one who, I mean, his name is associated in Egypt with socialism, but or at least with social justice, you know, an important social transformation in the 60s in particular. The important, you know, Arab nationalist movement against imperialism, non-alignment, and so on, industrialization, economic development, and so on. But at the same time, he created a police state and an extremely authoritarian regime. In particular, Nasser's vision and practice vis-à-vis the workers' movement was even more corporatist than any other bourgeois power in Egypt before or after. So he actually practically abolished trade unions while creating a structure void of content. And so Abu Aita is the product of these contradictions. He is sympathizing with the content of Nasserism in terms of social progress, but at the same time, he is not absolutely critical to the kind of corporatism, especially associated with Nasser, especially when it comes from the army. You know, he's someone who is extremely patriotic and so on. So, I mean, the day he became minister after 3 July, suddenly the discourse became that we, the workers, were the champions of strikes. Now we will be the champions of production. Of course, he was promising that he will resign if the law of trade union freedoms was not passed, and I also forgot to mention anything about this. So this was an important gain of the revolution. It was just a promise, you know. I mean, so far, independent trade unions are only tolerated basically on the basis of a promise by the state, but it did not become a law. There is a draft law that Abu Aita was promoting and he was promising to struggle for, and he actually totally forgot about it. He's now, as Fatma mentioned, proposing a labor law, even though the labor law does not tackle the question of trade unions, but a quite conservative labor law giving employers lots of more prerogatives in terms of firing and hiring and so on. But also, he did not lead the battle he promised about the trade union freedoms law. More importantly, he's hostile to strikes, and of course, he's part of the government. And in the name of, you know, the Brotherhood constituting a terrible existential danger, he is part of the statu quo totally. So this is, I think, the tragedy of even left Nasserism. But the problem is that I mean, Abu Aita would be a progressive version of what you might call the average worker's consciousness. This being said, the average worker will never be minister, of course. So, but the problem is that Nasserism was so popular among the working class, especially after it was defeated, actually, that there is this hegemony of what is sometimes called the moral economy perspective. That, I mean, there is a social contract with the Nasserist state. We, the workers, will stop any form of protestation and independent organization. But in return, the government will provide us with good wages, with good conditions, with stability of employment, and so on. And as you know, the post-Nasser regimes have actually kept the authoritarian aspect of Nasserism, but without the progressive. So the progressive became source of nostalgia, and so this is the consciousness that is dominant. But of course, people on the ground are going beyond this Nasserist consciousness, because actually they are struggling, and the notion of independent struggle is itself contradictory with Nasserism. So there has always been the potential for workers' consciousness to grow, and it has been growing. The trajectory is growing. I mean, it has been unthinkable 20 years ago that strikes become a normal mode of operation in Egypt. Now, not only you have thousands of strikes, but also you have independent organization. So I think it's a rising trajectory, but it requires lots of efforts, because the difference, I mean, I am convinced that one reason why workers are kept in this relatively narrow economism is also the general reactionary climate of the last 2 decades or so on questions like women, on sectarianism, and so on. So unless work, I mean, I think that I mean, I have lots of admiration for someone like Fatma Ramadan and her current within the independent labor movement, but I think they are not struggling enough on global issues, on general political issues like the women question, like Christians, and so on. And I think that this should be an important part of the struggle of leftist militants of the labor movement. Even though the Marxists, as you said, are generally marginal in society, but in fact, one of the important exceptions is in the labor movement. I mean, there has always been, because the left historically, even the Stalinist left, has been the best force struggling really with workers at different ages since the liberal pre-Nasser era up to now. The left has always had important strongholds in the labor movement, and today it has a potential, I think, to build upon this. I basically agree with you, Matt, on the fact that an uncritical attitude to Tamarrud was extremely problematic, but I think you're a little bit too firm, however, because I saw several discussions with Tamarrud people by people in the revolutionary left that I felt, of course, was not critical enough, but they were not totally supportive also either. I mean, I've seen criticism that was too mild. But the problem, again, is that, you know, Tamarruds could not by any means have said that we are ruling out military rule, because in fact, the bulk of their support came from people, even who thought that their movement is in continuation with the revolution, who are looking forward to the army, at least to stop Morsi and you know, the fanatic Islamists from delivering on their promises of massacring people and so on. So, I mean, I mean, I think, I mean, had I been there, my position would be to be hostile to Tamarrud and to expose their whole mythology. But I would have known that this would be totally irrelevant, because, I mean, any illusions that this will change, actually, when you take this position, you will be accused of being a pro-Brotherhood agent and so on. But of course, still, it would have been good to have an independent voice saying this, because afterwards, for many militants, it would have given lots of credibility for the people who said it. I think that today, within the revolutionary path front, there is a very interesting discussion going on between, you know, people from different backgrounds, but essentially leftist, but who are either ideologically really leftist or anarchist, liberals, or even some Islamists, who are left-leaning in general, and who are trying to draw the lessons of all this. What I feel, again, I'm repeating myself, that their discussions lack is that they are not sufficiently conscious of the danger of revolutionary in general being isolated. I mean, there is one thing, you know, early in 2011, the tide was going up, and saying that you are one of the youth of the revolution, for instance, would make you a hero. Now you risk being really beaten up in the street if people expose you as one of these youth. Now this is a terrible climate, and you cannot have the same perspective in struggle. I mean, we must today have a more of a propagandist attitude, and at the same time we have to be conscious that things can change. We shouldn't be fatalist and defeatist. But it's a very difficult, really demoralizing climate when you're in its midst also.
All right. I think.
Since the last question became a question, it was a commercial. I was wondering if we could ask one more question.
Well, this is the very last one.
Yeah, it's better because I finished on a very negative tone.
Go ahead quickly, please.
What are you guys doing right now? Why? Like, you need taxes.
Well, this is one task right here. There's a campaign.
Yeah. Sorry, no, please.
Are you talking?
No. I think I'm sorry for
The RS.
The RS.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no. I think that first, you guys, you mean in Egypt or in here?
No, in Egypt.
Yeah, because, you know, I am based here, so I do not pretend to be, you know, in the. Yeah, but I think that. I mean, I don't talk, I speak in the name of the revolutionary socialists, but the wider revolutionary left, I think, is really engaged in a heroic struggle. I mean, the climate is so dangerous. I mean, you have so many people now of my comrades and friends are in jail and in terrible conditions. And not because, I mean, the imprisonment becomes much more difficult when you are also conscious that you are even isolated from public opinion, that the bulk of public opinion is actually, I mean, you have extremely dramatic stories of, for instance, a woman who is denouncing her son because he belongs to a revolutionary group and saying, yes, the army, please arrest him, and so on. So really quite scary. So I think that the revolutionary left is leading a heroic struggle in different circumstances. It is opening up to wider circles, so this revolutionary front path includes people of different political colorings, but who are conscious that, I mean, there are certain goals of the revolution that we are continuing this and we have to gain them from below and so on. I think this is promising, provided it becomes more clever at the level of strategy and tactics. I think that the mood swings are expected, the illusions in El Sisi and so on will not last for very long, even though I think we should not also be very euphoric about, you know, that things will change necessarily. It might take a long time because the kind of nationalism that is dominant today with its echoes, I mean, because I think, for one, that the military is not exactly the continuation of the Mubarak regime, even though it is essentially so. But I think that it is not unexpected, it will not be unexpected for me if there is a populist turn, for instance, once El Sisi is elected, especially if he feels that he needs so in order to gain popular support. The army is in a position, given the weakness of both the traditional bourgeoisie, as you mentioned, Matt, but also the weakness of the working class politically. There is a kind of Bonapartist climate, you know, there is a vacuum and someone has to fill it, and the army, because also it has grievances with the security apparatus that are real, they might in fact have a certain leftist turn. Don't forget that even with the repression today, there have been, I mean, the current constitution, for the first time in Egypt's history, I mean in the last 40 years, is promising that the budget for education and health will be multiplied by 3 within the next 3 years. They already, as Fatma mentioned, passed the legislation increasing the minimum wage and also putting a maximum wage, even though it lacks in content. But in fact, they might be forced, if the movement from below is strong, to really give it more content. Anyway, many people in Egypt, you know, very liberal and moderate people, are convinced, those who are more rational, that important social reforms are necessary for the economy to work, for the purchasing power and so on. And given the nationalism and also the climate, you know, I think the politics of the Muslim Brotherhood today is actually very much promoting El Sisi and the army, not because they are terrorists, but because they are extremely I mean, they seem to be doing lots of trouble, but at the same time they are not destabilizing the regime at all, and they are actually moving towards more closure on themselves, so more sectarian discourse, anti-Christian, very extremely anti-Christian, anti-Coptic, anti-women also, and in general anti the population that they consider have you know, let them down and so on. All this is playing in the hands of El Sisi and those surround him, especially also given the regional context. You know, that it is very easy today in Egypt for a conservative opinion to say that the armies of all the countries around us are disintegrating the state. Look at Libya, look at Syria, and so on. So we need to keep that the stability of the state becomes suddenly a very attractive discourse. So I think that we need both to have a revolutionary strategy that is radically hostile to the regime, but at the same time conscious that now this position is a small minority, and that also the struggle for reform, even gaining reforms from within the current structure, is also important. It's too luxurious to argue that it is all or none, I think. And because the image of activists and militant people as, you know, irresponsible anarchists has to be challenged. And if we don't manage to challenge it, even if the regime becomes more crisis-ridden, it will not lead to any progressive outcome. So this is why I think the struggle for ideas, I think, is very important. And in this, I think, internationalism, and because solidarity is not just about you know, condemning violations and providing support, but also providing advice and having comradely discussions, I think, is vital.
So There is currently a petition against repression in Egypt. You can find that at egyptsolidarity.campaign.org.
I think it's outrageous that U.S. imperialism and its role was never mentioned once.